what I discovered is that countries that are oppressors, that continue to be colonial occupiers, are using financial muscle to provide granting aid to African countries and secure the depoliticized support of African countries for these.
Something shifted. Not in the headlines you've been fed, not in the press releases polished by spin doctors, but deep beneath the surface, where power really lives. Ask yourself this: what happens when the chains you thought were invisible start to rattle? What happens when the ground you thought was stable cracks under your feet? And what if the ones long dismissed as weak, dependent, powerless, suddenly flip the script and make the strong look desperate? We are talking about deep Western dependence on Africa and how it got really ugly after Africa stopped helping. Let's get into it. To believe that the United States sent soybeans and grains to Africa simply to help is to misunderstand the way empires operate. Nothing about food and geopolitics is neutral. Every bushel, every bag, every aid package that crossed the Atlantic was stamped not just with an American flag, but with a set of unspoken conditions. Food wasn't given, it was leveraged. Consider how U.S. agricultural policy evolved in the 20th century. Surplus crops, piled up after domestic subsidies and mechanized farming made production cheap, had to go somewhere. Dumping them in foreign markets killed two birds with one stone. It cleared stockpiles at home while creating dependency abroad. Africa, with its diverse climates and potential for agricultural independence, became the perfect testing ground. On paper, it looked like generosity. In reality, it was a slow erasure of self-sufficiency. Behind every gift of soy was a calculation. African markets were flooded with U.S. exports at prices local farmers could never match. Families who once grew their own staples were forced to abandon their fields because imported soy and grain undercut their labor. Once those local supply chains weakened, once knowledge of cultivation began to thin, the U.S. exporters turned the screws. Prices rose, conditions appeared. Suddenly, food was no longer sustenance. It was currency. It was pressure. It was the quietest weapon in Washington's arsenal. And this wasn't accidental. American agribusiness has long operated with the tacit blessing of the U.S. government. Agricultural lobbies in Washington thrive on overseas markets, and Africa was cast as emerging demand. To secure those markets, the U.S. used food the way it once used oil or military bases, as anchors of influence. Aid wasn't aid, it was strategy. African leaders who resisted quickly learned that the flow of soy could be slowed, rerouted, or outright cut. Food became a bargaining chip in diplomatic negotiations, from military agreements to voting alignments in international institutions. The impact on Africa's social fabric was devastating. Farmers who once fed their communities became consumers of imports. Markets tilted toward dependency, eroding pride in local cultivation. Rural economies stagnated under the shadow of foreign supply. To put it bluntly, food was weaponized not against hunger, but against sovereignty. But here's where the story shifts. Unlike the past, where African governments swallowed these conditions in silence, today they are reading the game differently. Leaders across the continent have begun to see that the most dangerous kind of colonization isn't military, it's agricultural. Guns can kill bodies, but food controls nations. If you dictate what people eat, you dictate how they live. And if Africa allowed Washington to keep dictating, the dream of self-determination would remain permanently out of reach. So when the announcement came to block $124 billion worth of U.S. soybeans, it wasn't a tantrum or a gamble. It was the climax of decades of awareness. Africa had decoded the lie. The U.S. was never feeding Africa. It was feeding itself, fattening its corporations, securing its political leverage, and disguising it all as partnership. And now that the curtain is pulled back. Which brings us to the next burning question. If food was always a weapon, then what happens when that weapon slips out of Washington's hands and turns back on its own people, the farmers in America's heartland? The U.S. heartland has always lived with a myth stitched into its soil. The idea that the American farmer doesn't just feed the nation, but feeds the world. Generations of families in Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, and Missouri, people who rose before dawn to work endless fields of soy and corn, were raised on the belief that their labor was indispensable. Washington repeated the mantra, trade deals reinforced it, and export statistics seemed to prove it. Africa, in particular, was painted as the future, the continent that would forever soak up America's surplus crops. But myths don't survive reality. And the reality today is brutal. Africa just walked away. The blockade of $124 billion in soybeans didn't just cut into U.S. profits. It shredded the very foundation of the Midwest economy. Silos that once symbolized abundance now groan with unsold stock. Prices nosedive as the global market adjusts to the shock. Bank loans, taken against the assumption of endless demand, suddenly turn toxic. Equipment payments stall. Land values sag. Entire rural towns that orbit around agriculture, tractor dealerships, grain elevators, processing plants, now stand on the edge of collapse. The statistics only capture part of the story. The deeper wound is psychological. For decades, the American farmer was sold a lie, that the world couldn't live without him. Yet here stands Africa, alive and thriving, saying, "We don't need your beans anymore." That's not just a market loss. That's humiliation. That's a cultural earthquake in a region where identity has always been tied to production. And the timing couldn't be worse. Farmers were already battered by Trump's tariff wars with China, which closed off their single largest customer. Washington tried to soothe the wounds with subsidies, but subsidies can't buy dignity. Now Africa, the last promised market, has slammed the door. It feels less like bad luck and more like betrayal. The very empire that told the Midwest it would always protect them is crumbling under its own arrogance, leaving the farmer abandoned in the wreckage. The consequences are spilling beyond economics. Bankruptcies are rising. Suicides, already at alarming rates among U.S. farmers, are climbing higher. Foreclosures on farmland are accelerating, echoing the pain of the 1980s farm crisis. Politicians who once strolled through soybean fields every election cycle are now running from town halls where angry farmers demand answers. The same rural communities that formed the bedrock of America's political machine are beginning to see Washington not as their protector, but as their executioner. This is the paradox. The empire that weaponized food against Africa is now being consumed by the very strategy it perfected. The Midwest was never shielded from collapse. It was only delayed. The machine that once kept African farmers dependent is now cannibalizing America's own. Soybeans that once symbolized global dominance are now symbols of decay. And the anger is boiling. You can hear it in the voices of farmers at co-ops, in the panic of small-town bankers, in the speeches of politicians who are suddenly forced to admit that maybe, just maybe, Africa's independence is America's downfall. The chain of dependency that Washington wrapped around Africa has snapped, and the recoil is breaking America's back. But here's the twist. While the Midwest collapses under the weight of its own failed empire, Africa is not starving. Quite the opposite. It's a building. Which raises the next question. How did Africa, long painted as helpless, find the strength to stand tall when America stumbled? Let's pause for a second to say, big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. Strength is never an accident. What looks like an overnight revolt is usually the product of years, sometimes decades, of groundwork. That's exactly what happened with Africa's soybean revolution. While Washington was busy treating food as a weapon, Africa was quietly building the shield and eventually, the sword. The turning point wasn't just economic. It was philosophical. African leaders began to link political sovereignty with agricultural sovereignty. They understood that a nation that cannot feed itself can never call itself free. This shift wasn't born in boardrooms. It was born in fields, in research stations, in policies that tied food production directly to independence. The slogan became clear. If sovereignty starts anywhere, it starts in the soil. From there, investments poured in. Governments funded irrigation projects to tame drought-prone regions. Research institutes, once starved of resources, received backing to develop local seed varieties adapted to African conditions. Fertilizer plants sprouted across the continent, reducing reliance on expensive imports. Processing facilities were built to ensure soy wasn't just grown, but also crushed into oil and meal locally, capturing value that once leaked overseas. But the genius wasn't just in pouring money, it was in building partnerships that didn't replicate dependency. Brazil was approached not as a master, but as a collaborator. Its decades of tropical soybean cultivation were studied, adapted, and localized. Indian firms supplied hybrid seeds tailored to dry climates, but the technology transfer meant Africa could eventually produce its own. China financed large-scale infrastructure, dams, irrigation systems, and crushing plants, but Africans ran them. Every agreement was calculated to ensure Africa was learning, not just buying. Farmers, too, became central to this revolution. Governments began organizing cooperatives to protect smallholders, giving them access to credit and machinery. Universities rolled out training programs, equipping a new generation of agronomists with the knowledge to boost yields without repeating Western mistakes. The rise of mobile technology meant even rural farmers could access weather forecasts, market prices, and agronomic tips in real time. In short, Africa was no longer begging for survival. It was engineering resilience. And resilience mattered. Because Washington assumed that dependency was permanent, it didn't notice Africa's quiet buildup. By the time the US realized what was happening, silos in Africa were no longer empty, fields were no longer underutilized, and crushing plants were humming. The blockade of US soybeans was not a reckless protest. It was the logical conclusion of years of preparation. What makes this story more powerful is that it wasn't just governments pushing the agenda. Farmers across the continent began to see themselves not as mere producers, but as guardians of sovereignty. To plant soy was to declare independence. To harvest it was to break a chain. This psychological shift, where agriculture became resistant, was as revolutionary as the infrastructure itself. And here lies the irony. America's greatest miscalculation wasn't overestimating its strength, it was underestimating Africa's patience. While Washington flexed, Africa prepared. And when the moment came, Africa didn't just reject US soy, it revealed it no longer needed it. Which brings us to the next chapter of this story. If Africa built strength at home, who were the external allies that stood beside it, reinforcing its defiance against Washington? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. Empires collapse the moment their monopoly breaks. Washington's mistake wasn't just underestimating Africa's capacity, it was assuming no one else would step in to fill the gap. But Africa did not walk into independence alone. It built a web of alliances that made the blockade possible and sustainable. Brazil, India, and China, three powers with their own histories of resisting Western dominance, became Africa's chosen partners. Each played a distinct role, and together they formed the scaffolding of Africa's agricultural liberation. Take Brazil. Few countries understand the transformation of agriculture better. In the 1970s, Brazil itself was dependent on US grain, written off as unsuitable for mass soybean production. Yet through research, tropical seed innovation, and sheer will, it turned into the world's second-largest soy exporter. For African nations, Brazil wasn't a benefactor, it was a mirror of what could be achieved. Brazilian scientists trained African agronomists, shared tropical cultivation methods, and helped design systems that worked with Africa's soil, not against it. Unlike the US, which sold dependency, Brazil offered a roadmap to sovereignty. Then came India. Where Brazil offered scale, India offered adaptability. Its seed companies developed drought-resistant hybrids tailored for arid regions, perfect for African farmers facing climate volatility. But it wasn't just about seeds. India opened its universities, welcomed African students, and invested in training programs that created a new generation of agricultural experts. This was not charity, it was an exchange. India, too, wanted stronger trade partners and markets, but it built them by raising Africa, not by breaking it down. And then there was China, the financial powerhouse willing to put money where its mouth was. While Washington lectured Africa about good governance before releasing aid, Beijing financed irrigation projects, built crushing plants, and laid roads that connected farms to markets. To critics, this looked like a new form of dominance, but to African governments it was leverage. Finally, a partner willing to back infrastructure without using food as political ransom. China's money unlocked Africa's potential, but Africa kept control over its terms. Together, these alliances broke Washington's chokehold. No longer could the US threaten to starve markets or stall aid. Africa had alternatives, and those alternatives weren't just economic, they were political statements. By choosing South-South solidarity, Africa declared that its future lay not in dependency on the West, but in partnership with those who shared its scars and ambitions. And the symbolism is impossible to ignore. Brazil, once a victim of US agricultural dominance, is now empowering Africa. India, once colonized, is now arming Africa with seeds of resilience. China, once bullied by Western markets, now finances Africa's leap into self-sufficiency. Each alliance carried echoes of defiance, a reminder that empires don't last forever, but solidarity does. This wasn't Africa trading one master for another. It was Africa playing on the field. By diversifying partnerships, the continent created competition for its attention, ensuring no single power could dictate terms. That's the real genius. Africa turned its vulnerability into bargaining power. And it leaves us with the biggest question yet. If Africa can say no to America on soybeans, and yes to new partners on equal terms, what else can it say no to? What comes after food sovereignty? What other chains are ready to be broken? Soybeans are not the endgame. They are the warning shot. The $124 billion blockade may look like a trade dispute on the surface, but beneath it lies a declaration of war against dependency itself. Africa didn't just close its ports to US soy, it opened the door to a future where every sector, every resource, every supply chain is reclaimed from Western control. Food sovereignty is the first battlefield, but the logic spreads everywhere. If Africa can reject foreign grain, why not reject foreign dictates on oil exports? If it can replace US soy with local production and South-South partnerships, why not replace Western banks with African-owned financial institutions? The principle is the same. Dependency breeds weakness. Sovereignty breeds strength. Soy is the metaphor, but the mission is much larger. An Africa that owns its destiny across the board. Take energy. For decades, Western companies drilled Africa's oil, mined its uranium, and exported its gas, leaving behind little more than pollution and poverty. But now, the mood has shifted. Leaders are investing in refineries, renewable energy grids, and local processing plants, refusing to let crude resources leave without value added. Just as soy is being crushed locally into oil and meal, so too are Africa's raw minerals and fuels being redirected into African factories. The message is simple. Africa is done being the world's quarry. Finance tells the same story. Food aid was once tied to loans from the IMF and World Bank, institutions that dictated austerity and kept Africa chained to debt. But with the success of the soybean blockade, confidence is growing in African alternatives. Regional development banks, sovereign wealth funds, and even experimental digital currencies under the African Continental Free Trade Area are gaining momentum. If the continent can feed itself without US soy, why can't it also finance itself without US dollars? Even politics is being reshaped. For too long, Western governments used food and aid as bargaining chips to secure loyalty in international forums. That leverage is crumbling. With food sovereignty as the foundation, African states can now walk into the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, or even the G20 with a new voice, one that cannot be silenced by the threat of empty stomachs. The blockade of soy is symbolic, yes, but symbols matter. It says, we are no longer hostages to your harvest, and this liberation isn't contained by borders. The African Continental Free Trade Area is knitting together markets, removing tariffs between nations, and turning 55 fragmented economies into a single force. Soybeans were the trial run. If Nigeria can feed Ghana and Kenya can trade grain with Tanzania without going through Washington, then Africa is no longer an importer, it is an empire of producers. The soy blockade proved the machinery works. Now it will be scaled up to every sector, which brings us back full circle. Soy was never about soy. It was about leverage. It was about who holds the chain and who wears it. For decades, America believed Africa could never live without US farmers. Today, it is Washington staring at overflowing silos, while Africa celebrates sovereignty harvested from its own soil. So let's not mistake this for a blip in trade flows. This is a rupture in history. Soy was the first domino, but many others are lined up. Finance, minerals, energy, and diplomacy. The question is no longer whether Africa can survive without the West. The question is, can the West survive a world where Africa is finally free? If Africa can block US soy, what else can it block tomorrow? Let us know in the comments section. If food is no longer America's weapon, what power does Washington really have left? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.